She didn't come to the courthouse to make a scene, just to file a form, fix a parking ticket, go home. But the bailiff took one look and said, "Hands out. You're going in cuffs." She didn't argue, didn't explain. And when they locked her to the bench, her sleeve slipped just enough to expose the marks on her forearm. That's when the Admiral walked in, stopped mid-step, and said 4 words that froze the entire courtroom. "Uncuff her, right now," because those weren't just faded marks. And she wasn't just any defendant either. She was the deadliest Overwatch sniper the SEALs had ever trained. Want to know what happened next? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The Alameda County Municipal Courthouse squatted like a concrete bunker, 3 blocks from the Naval Station, its beige walls stained with decades of coastal fog and exhaust fumes. The morning air carried the sharp bite of salt from the bay, mixed with diesel from the truck route, and that particular smell of old government buildings, floor wax, burnt coffee, and the ghosts of 1,000 nervous conversations. Elena Briggs pulled her beat-up Honda into the visitor lot, the engine coughing twice before settling into silence. The parking meter closest to her car was broken, its digital display flickering between expired and random numbers, while a handwritten sign taped to the post read "Exact change only." Through her windshield, she could see seagulls wheeling over the parking meters, their cries mixing with the distant sound of harbor traffic. A city bus rumbled past, its brakes hissing, while somewhere across the street, a maintenance crew was running a leaf blower that echoed off the courthouse walls like sustained gunfire. The morning fog was just beginning to lift, leaving everything damp and gray. Elena could taste the moisture in the air, that familiar weight that settled in your lungs when you lived this close to the ocean. It reminded her of other mornings in other places where fog had been a blessing that kept you hidden from eyes that meant you harm. She sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. 42 years old, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, lines around green eyes that had seen too much sun and too many sleepless nights. She wore what she always wore, faded Levi's soft from years of washing, scuffed running shoes that had walked more miles than most people drove, and a black zip-up hoodie that hung loose on her small frame. This was her 4th trip to a government building in the past 2 months. First, the VA regional office in Oakland, where a clerk had informed her that her disability rating was under review because someone had flagged her address change as suspicious. Then the county assessor's office, where she'd spent 3 hours in plastic chairs waiting to prove she lived where she said she lived. Then back to the VA, where a different clerk had told her she needed court documentation to verify her housing status. Each visit had generated more paperwork, more appointments, more opportunities for the system to lose track of her existence. Elena stepped out slowly, deliberately. Her movements had that economy of motion that comes from years of making every gesture count, every step calculated. She checked her phone once, slipped it into her back pocket, and pulled a manila envelope from the passenger seat. The envelope was creased from handling, stamped and dated, containing forms that should have been simple to file, but had somehow become a bureaucratic nightmare. To anyone watching from the courthouse steps, she looked like just another person dealing with the grinding machinery of local government. Maybe someone behind on bills, maybe a property dispute, maybe nothing more complicated than a traffic violation. Her posture didn't suggest drama or defiance, just resignation to a process that had to be endured. But Elena wasn't here by choice. She was here because the VA Housing Review Board had flagged her address change, which had triggered a review of her disability status, which had led to a request for updated documentation, which had somehow resulted in a missed court date for a parking citation she'd never seen, the kind of administrative cascade that could swallow weeks of your life if you weren't careful. She'd driven 3 hours from her place near Monterey, a converted shipping container on a friend's property, where she paid $200 a month and nobody asked questions about the nights she woke up shouting or the days she couldn't get out of bed. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. And quiet had become the most valuable thing in her life. The courthouse lobby smelled like disinfectant and stale cigarettes, despite the no smoking signs posted every 10 feet. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that institutional greenish glow that made healthy people look sick and sick people look dead. The walls were covered with notices about jury duty, restraining orders, and traffic court schedules, all printed in fonts too small to read without squinting. A water fountain in the corner dripped steadily into a puddle that maintenance had given up trying to fix. Behind the information desk, a clerk with tired eyes and a badge that read Mrs. Patterson was sorting through a stack of files while simultaneously fielding phone calls from people who clearly didn't understand that she couldn't solve their problems over the phone. She looked up as Elena approached, her expression already sliding into that professional indifference government workers perfected after their first year. "Help you?" Elena placed the envelope on the counter, noting how Patterson's eyes briefly took in her appearance. The worn clothing, the lack of jewelry, the general air of someone who wasn't going to be a high-maintenance case. "I'm here for the Briggs case. VA documentation review." Patterson's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, pecking at keys while keeping half her attention on Elena and half on the phone that kept ringing every 30 seconds. "Elena Briggs, you missed your court date. Judge issued a bench warrant." The words hung in the air between them. In the background, Elena could hear someone at the metal detector arguing with security about their belt buckle, while a baby cried somewhere near the family court entrance. Normal courthouse chaos, the kind that ground people down until they just wanted to escape back to their cars. Elena's expression didn't change. "I was never notified of a court date." "Says here you were served at your address of record." Patterson turned her monitor slightly, showing a screen full of case numbers and dates. "You need to speak with the bailiff about warrant resolution." That's when Sergeant Mike Kowalski appeared from the side hallway, all 230 pounds of him moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd spent 20 years in county corrections before taking this job. He wore his uniform tight across his chest, duty belt loaded with the tools of courthouse authority, and carried himself with the kind of swagger that came from never having been seriously challenged. "Elena Briggs?" His voice carried across the lobby, turning heads. "You're coming with me." Elena looked at Patterson, then at Kowalski. "I'm here to file paperwork." "Yeah, well, you can file it from lockup." Kowalski moved closer, one hand resting casually on his cuffs. "Failure to appear means you get processed first, paperwork second. That's how it works." He gestured toward her hands. "Turn around." Elena stood perfectly still for a moment, calculating. She could explain. Could tell him about the VA mess, the address change, the notification that never came. Could mention that she'd driven 3 hours just to sort this out, that she had all the documentation right there in the envelope. Instead, she simply turned around and put her hands behind her back. The handcuffs clicked into place with that distinctive metallic sound that made everyone in the lobby stop what they were doing. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Cell phone calls were interrupted. Even the clerk looked up from her files, suddenly interested in the small drama unfolding at her desk. A young mother near the family court entrance pulled her toddler closer, as if criminality might be contagious. Parking citation, Kowalski announced to the room, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully imposed order on chaos. Lady thinks she can just ignore the courts, show up whenever she feels like it. An older man in a rumpled suit, probably a public defender, based on the overstuffed briefcase and the look of someone who'd seen this exact scene 1,000 times, shook his head and muttered something about the system eating people alive. A courthouse reporter with a press badge clipped to her jacket looked up from her phone, evaluating whether this was worth a paragraph in tomorrow's local section. Near the metal detector, a group of potential jurors whispered among themselves, their civic duty suddenly feeling more like voyeurism. "Should have just paid the ticket online," someone said behind them. "Now look where attitude gets you." He guided Elena toward the hallway that led to the courtrooms, his grip firm on her upper arm. As they walked, he kept talking, partly to her, partly to anyone within earshot, his voice echoing off the walls lined with portraits of dead judges and faded American flags. "You know what your problem is? You people think the rules don't apply to you. Military service, disability check, whatever sob story you got, doesn't matter. Judge says be here Tuesday at 9. You be here Tuesday at 9. Elena said nothing, just walked where he directed her, her footsteps echoing off the institutional tile floors. "I got a nephew in the Marines," Kowalski continued. "Kid's got more respect for authority than you do, and he's barely old enough to drink. Of course, he actually served in combat. Not like some of these wannabes we get in here." They passed a bulletin board covered with wanted posters and public service announcements, then turned down a narrower hallway, lined with doors marked Authorized Personnel Only and Attorney Conference Room C. The air here was staler, tinged with the smell of old carpet and whatever industrial cleaner they used on the floors. Courtroom 2B was smaller than Elena had expected, with maybe 30 seats divided by a center aisle and a raised bench where Judge Harold Brennan presided over the morning's collection of traffic violations, small claims disputes, and municipal code violations. Brennan was in his early 60s, silver-haired and soft around the middle, with the kind of tired authority that came from processing thousands of minor infractions over decades on the bench. He looked up as Kowalski escorted Elena to the defendant's area, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he scanned the file. "Elena Briggs, case number 4271-B. Failure to appear on municipal citation. Violation of Parking Ordinance 15.2.7. His voice carried the rhythmic cadence of someone who'd read similar charges 100 times that week. "Outstanding fine of $240 plus court costs." Kowalski positioned Elena in front of the bench, still cuffed, while a scattered collection of other defendants, lawyers, and courthouse staff filled the gallery behind them. In the back row, 2 young officers from the local JAG office, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Walsh and Lieutenant Joey Masterson, were reviewing files for their next case, their conversation a low murmur punctuated by the occasional shuffle of papers. "Ma'am, you missed your scheduled appearance," Judge Brennan continued, looking at Elena over his glasses. "The court sent notification to your address of record." Elena straightened slightly. "Your Honor, I never received any notification. I've been dealing with a VA address change That's not the court's concern," Brennan interrupted. "You're responsible for maintaining current contact information. The warrant was properly issued." Behind them, Walsh leaned over to Masterson. "Another one of those disability cases. They think missing court dates doesn't matter because they've got PTSD or whatever." Masterson nodded, not looking up from his file. "Always got an excuse." "I never got the notice. I was in the hospital. My therapist said, gets old after a while." Their voices were just loud enough to carry to the front of the courtroom. Elena's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but she kept her eyes forward. Judge Brennan was already moving on to sentencing. Given the failure to appear, And the outstanding fine? I'm ordering you remanded to county holding until the amount can be paid or a payment plan established. He banged his gavel once, that sharp crack echoing through the small courtroom. Next case. Kowalski touched Elena's elbow, preparing to escort her out when something happened that nobody expected. As she turned to follow him, the handcuffs pulled her arms back slightly, causing her hoodie sleeves to ride up. Not much, maybe an inch or two, but enough to expose the inside of her left forearm, where a series of small marks were etched into the skin just below her wrist. 9 short lines, precise, deliberate, burned into flesh rather than tattooed. Each mark was about an inch long, perfectly parallel, and spaced exactly a 1/4 inch apart. They looked like hash marks a prisoner might make on a cell wall, counting days. But these weren't counting time. They were counting lives. Lieutenant Commander Walsh stopped mid-sentence, her file forgotten in her lap. She'd spent 6 years as a Navy intelligence analyst before law school, and she'd seen marks like those before, in classified briefings, in after-action reports that were buried so deep they technically didn't exist. The kind of documents that came with security clearances that had their own security clearances. Her face went pale. "Holy shit," she whispered. Masterson looked up from his paperwork, annoyed at the interruption. "What?" "Those marks. On her arm." Walsh's voice was barely audible, but there was something in it that made everyone nearby strain to listen. Her training was kicking in. The analytical mind that could spot patterns in chaos, connections that others missed. "I've seen those before." "What are you talking about?" Walsh stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on Elena's forearm, as Kowalski continued to escort her toward the side door. The marks were clearly visible now, stark against her pale skin, each one a precise reminder of something most people would never understand. They weren't random. They weren't decorative. They were methodical, purposeful, burned into flesh with the kind of precision that spoke of military discipline. "SEAL Overwatch Protocol," Walsh said, her voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place. "Confirmed kills over 800 yards. They weren't supposed to mark them, but some of the Tier 1 operators did it anyway. Off the books. I wrote intelligence summaries on those operations when I was stationed at SOCOM. The courtroom was still moving around them. The judge calling the next case, other defendants shifting in their seats, lawyers conferring with clients in urgent whispers. But in the back row, a small pocket of stunned silence was growing as Walsh pulled out her phone. The courtroom was still moving around them, the judge calling the next case, other defendants shifting in their seats, lawyers conferring with clients. But in the back row, a small pocket of stunned silence was growing. Masterson leaned forward. "Are you sure?" "I wrote reports on those operations." Walsh's training was kicking in now. The analytical mind that had once parsed intelligence from war zones now focused on the woman being led away in handcuffs. "We had a sniper, call sign Overwatch 7, who worked with SEAL Team 6 in Yemen and Somalia. Off-books operations. Tier 0 stuff." She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. A few taps, a security code, access to databases that weren't supposed to exist. "Overwatch 7, she whispered, reading from the screen. "Elena Briggs, killed in action, 2012. Except..." She looked up, her eyes tracking Elena's path toward the exit. "Except she's standing right there." The courthouse holding area was exactly what Elena had expected. A long wooden bench behind a low partition with a clipboard bolted to the wall for intake paperwork. No bars, no privacy, just a place to wait while the system decided what to do with you. The bench was scarred with decades of nervous fidgeting, carved with initials and phone numbers from people who'd sat in this exact spot, wondering how their day had gone so wrong. She sat with the same quiet composure she'd maintained throughout the hearing, her hands now uncuffed and resting calmly in her lap. The marks on her forearm were still visible, catching the fluorescent light from overhead. She didn't try to hide them, didn't pull her sleeves down, just sat there, patient as stone, waiting for whatever came next. This wasn't her first time being processed by a system that didn't understand her, and she'd learned long ago that resistance only made things worse. Across the hallway, Walsh was making phone calls. Urgent, whispered conversations with people who answered after one ring and spoke in careful, measured tones. Intelligence contacts, old supervisors, people who might remember a sniper who'd officially died in a building collapse in Marib, but might have survived something that never made it into any official report. Elna could hear fragments of the conversations, but her expression never changed. She'd learned long ago that the past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how carefully you tried to bury it. The trick was not to resist when it happened. Just let it wash over you and keep breathing. 20 minutes later, the courthouse's main entrance doors opened with a sound like controlled thunder. Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne entered with the kind of presence that shifted the atmospheric pressure of a room. Late 60s, broad-shouldered despite his age, wearing dress whites that looked like they'd been pressed moments before he put them on. His ribbons told stories of 3 decades in naval special operations, including deployments to places that didn't appear on any map. The Navy Cross gleamed among them, along with 3 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart that suggested he'd paid for his authority in blood. He moved through the courthouse lobby with purposeful strides, his cap tucked under his left arm, his face set in an expression of barely controlled fury. Behind him, 2 junior officers struggled to keep pace, their own uniforms crisp but somehow diminished by proximity to the Admiral's authority. One carried a briefcase that bore the seal of Naval Special Warfare Command. The other clutched a secure phone that had been buzzing every 30 seconds since they'd left the base. The lobby conversations died as he passed. Clerks looked up from their desks, suddenly aware that someone important had entered their domain. Lawyers paused mid-conversation with clients, recognizing command presence when they saw it. Even the security guards straightened unconsciously, responding to something in his bearing that demanded attention without asking for it. Mrs. Patterson actually stood up behind her desk, an honor she hadn't accorded anyone since the last time a federal judge had visited. He found the information desk and addressed Mrs. Patterson with the kind of voice that expected immediate compliance. "I need to speak with whoever's holding Elena Briggs." Patterson's fingers flew across her keyboard, suddenly motivated to work faster than she had all morning. "Sir, she's in holding, pending." "I don't care what she's pending. Get me to her, now." The word "now" carried the weight of command decisions made under fire, of situations where hesitation meant people died. Patterson stood immediately, gesturing toward the hallway that led to the courtrooms. Admiral Thorne found Elna exactly where he expected to, sitting calmly on the holding bench, her hands folded, her face composed. When she saw him, she stood slowly, coming to attention without the formal rigidity of a parade ground, just the unconscious straightening that came from muscle memory older than civilian life. "Admiral," she said quietly. "Elena." His voice was gentler now, but still carried the authority that had brought him across the building. "They told me you were dead." "I was supposed to be." He nodded, understanding flowing between them in the kind of shorthand that only came from where he shared experience in places where the normal rules didn't apply. Then he turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. Courthouse staff, the JAG officers, Judge Brennan, who had emerged from his courtroom to see what the commotion was about. "Does anyone in this building know who this woman is?" His voice carried across the hallway, cutting through the ambient noise of courthouse business. "Anyone know what she's done?" Silence. The kind of complete quiet that only came when people suddenly realized they might be in the presence of something they didn't understand. She's the sniper who held overwatch on Operation Copper Rain, Marib Province, Yemen, 2012. She was positioned on a 6-story building with clear sight lines to 3 extraction points when it took a direct hit from an RPG. Building collapsed. We found her in the rubble 18 hours later, still alive, still conscious, still talking her team through the extraction on a radio that should have been destroyed in the collapse. Thorne's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been there, who'd seen the aftermath, who'd helped pull bodies from concrete and twisted steel. She had a broken back, collapsed lung, and a piece of rebar through her left shoulder. Radio was held together with medical tape and willpower, but she stayed on station because 43 American service members were depending on her voice to guide them home. Judge Brennan stepped forward, his earlier authority replaced by something that looked like embarrassment, mixed with genuine horror. Admiral, we had no way of knowing. You had every way of knowing. It's called asking. It's called treating people with basic human dignity, instead of processing them like paperwork. Thorne's eyes swept the gathered crowd, taking in faces that ranged from shame to curiosity to genuine remorse. It's called recognizing that the person standing in front of you might have stories you can't imagine. He turned his attention to Lieutenant Commander Walsh, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, her phone still in her hand, her security clearance finally proving useful for something that mattered. Commander, you recognize the marks. Why didn't you speak up? Walsh straightened, her academy training warring with the sick feeling in her stomach. I wasn't certain, sir. The records showed her KIA. Sometimes operators get tattoos that aren't officially sanctioned. The records showed a lot of things, including the fact that Overwatch 7 saved 43 lives that day by staying on station when any sane person would have evacuated. He looked around the hallway, his gaze taking in each face, memorizing them. She was awarded the Navy Cross, classified. No ceremony, no citation, just a piece of paper in a file that 3 people in Washington have access to. And the reason it's classified isn't to protect national security. It's because the operation she supported was so black that acknowledging her heroism would require acknowledging we were there in the first place. The hallway had grown completely silent now. Even the ambient courthouse noise seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Kowalski stood frozen near the holding area entrance, his face pale, realizing that the woman he'd handcuffed and humiliated had earned more respect in one day than he'd shown in his entire career. Elena stood quietly through the entire exchange, her expression unchanged. When Thorne finished speaking, she stepped forward slightly. Admiral, I appreciate this, but I just came here to file my paperwork. That's all I wanted. He studied her face for a moment, seeing something there that the others missed. The kind of weariness that came not from physical exhaustion, but from carrying weight that couldn't be set down. What kind of paperwork? VA housing review. They flagged my address change, needed updated documentation. She gestured toward the manila envelope still tucked under her arm. Same bureaucratic shuffle that's been going on for 10 years. Thorne nodded slowly. Then he turned to Judge Brennan. This proceeding is dismissed. All charges dropped. All fines waived. And if any part of this appears in her record, I'll have it expunged by close of business today. Brennan nodded quickly. Of course, Admiral. Absolutely. And Judge? Thorne's voice carried a note of finality. The next time someone walks into your courtroom, maybe ask yourself if you know their story before you decide what they deserve. Elena was already walking toward the exit, her envelope clutched in one hand, her other hand unconsciously pulling down her sleeve to cover the marks that had started this whole encounter. She moved with the same quiet purpose she'd maintained throughout the morning, ready to get back in her car and drive the 3 hours home to her shipping container and her carefully constructed solitude. But as she reached the courthouse doors, a young clerk hurried after her. Maybe 25 years old, nervous, still learning the job. "Ma'am?" He held out a business card. "If you ever need help with VA paperwork, my mom works at the regional office. She said to tell you thank you." Elna took the card, looked at it for a moment, then tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you." She pushed through the doors into the morning sunlight, where the sounds of harbor traffic and seagulls were already washing away the echoes of the courthouse drama. Her Honda started on the first try this time, and she pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. Admiral Thorne watched her go from the courthouse steps, his cap now back on his head, his junior officers flanking him uncertainly. "Sir," one of them ventured, "shouldn't we escort her? Make sure she gets whatever she needs?" Thorne shook his head. "She's been taking care of herself for 10 years. She doesn't need us to start now." He turned to head back to his car, then paused, looking back at the courthouse where a small crowd was still gathered in the lobby, processing what they'd witnessed. "But maybe," he said quietly, "we need to remember that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like." Elna drove north on Highway 101, the courthouse shrinking in her rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. The radio played softly, some country station that faded in and out with the coastal hills, and the morning fog was beginning to burn off, revealing patches of blue sky over the Monterey Bay. She had her paperwork, she had her freedom, and she had the same quiet life she'd built for herself, one careful day at a time. The marks on her forearm were hidden again, beneath her sleeve. But they were still there, 9 small reminders of a different life, a different version of herself, who'd done things that mattered in ways most people would never understand. She wasn't that person anymore, hadn't been for years. But sometimes, just sometimes, it helped to remember that she had been. The Honda crested a hill, and the bay spread out below her, dotted with sailboats and seabirds, peaceful and endless under the climbing sun. Elena Briggs drove home. Ever wonder how many heroes are sitting quietly in courtrooms, DMV offices, and government buildings, just trying to navigate the same bureaucracy as everyone else? How many times have you seen someone treated poorly and assumed they deserved it? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think twice about judging someone by their appearance, hit that subscribe button. At Legacy Valor, we believe every quiet hero deserves respect. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.